Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to Philanthropy Network for bringing us together. Congratulations, Christine, on your new post. Congratulations on your great team, especially Mariah, who put us all together. Thank you all. Thank you to Michael O'Brien, first of all, for your remarks. And secondly, for taking your jacket off, which gave me permission to take off that hot thing. And thank you all for being here. So my marching orders are to facilitate a discussion with our great panel here today about equity in the region. And so it's been said that in this democratic capitalist society, we have three sectors that makes the world go round. One is the government sector, Department of Transportation, Department of Schools, Department of this. The second sector is the private sector, Wells Fargo, for example, Starbucks, Tasty Cake. And the third sector is the nonprofit sector, which does things that neither the for-profit sector nor the government sector can do. So this room represents our three sectors, and this panel represents the three sectors. So to my left, your right, is Chekemma Fulmore-Townsend, who's the president of the Hamilton Family Charitable Trust. I trust that you read the commitment that we had to read, and so you cannot harass her for money during this conference. The minute she steps outside on Wayne Junction, she's free for all. Next to her is Allison Budschalow, who's senior partner of Dragonfly Partners, which provides capacity building support to many nonprofits like those in the room. And next to her is Amy Nieves, representing the government sector, and she is executive director of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. And finally, but not least, is representing the for-profit sector, our friend Tiffany Tavarez from Wells Fargo, who works in the Office of Representation and Inclusion. So to start us off, I'm going to ask them a series of questions. They've been warned that they have 3 minutes or less to answer, so that then we can have time for questions, comments, and reflections. So I'm looking at all of you. First question is, the topic for today is equity in the region. And so what is your definition of equity? You can copy, paste, steal Christine's original definition, but in your various sectors that you represent, from a foundation perspective, what's your definition of equity?
Three minutes will be a challenge, but I'm going to take it on. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that you can't, they told me that I didn't press anything. How about now? No? I can use my Brooklyn voice.
You can talk next time.
Listen, I'm always a New York girl at heart. I can use my Philly voice because I love my
Testing.
But the reality is you can't have a conversation about equity without talking about disparity. And oftentimes we have conversations about equity without being specific, or we're not able to name and measure the disparity. So in the work that we do at the Hamilton Family Charitable Trust and Hamilton Family Foundation is to look at disparities, particularly in the education experience, so particularly around literacy and career learning. And we ask ourselves, who is experiencing great, high-quality learning exchanges and who is not? And what can we do about that? And we try to be really tactical about that. Which communities, which populations, how much, what are we measuring? Things like high school graduation rates, persistence in schools. And we're constantly looking at how do we balance that from a very clear and practical measure-based stance. So that's our definition of equity.
Well, you get an A+. 2 minutes. Allison, you've worked in nonprofits, and now you support nonprofits and their various leadership needs. So from a nonprofit perspective, what's your definition of equity?
I'll use my Philly voice too.
Take it away.
I mean, the definition of equity, to build off of what Chekemma said, to build off of what we heard probably on Tuesday as well, is the fact that we can all be in this room is part of the equity. It's part
part of having that conversation, all of us together, coming from the different conditions in which we all lived, grew up in. I'm from Philly, so I'm coming to you with that. I'm coming to you with decades in the nonprofit sector and community-based organizations. I think I'm representing kind of the community voice here, which is interesting to me, but I'll get into that. But equity is having the chance to even be on a platform or a stage, literally, to be able to talk about what is of interest to folks, to organizations, to communities in the city of Philadelphia. What are the real life conditions that folks are navigating, and what are the possible ways that we can partner with each other to address those? That's equity, being able to be here, being able to be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you. So Amy, the mayor's office has the mayor's office for immigrants, mayor's office for people with disabilities. From a governmental perspective, what's your definition of equity?
Thank you. So again, my name is Amy Nieves, and I feel that when we talk about equity, for me, it's does everyone have equitable access to the conversation, the built environment, the program, the policy? Does it make sense from a language access point, from an accessibility standpoint? Can everyone actually hear you? And I say that as a neurodivergent who is also deaf, is that, you know, a lot of times we have folks that are creating policies about people without those people. And I think if we're going to talk about equity, we have to actually make sure that people have access to the conversation that you are having about them. And to Christine's point, that's a long-standing tagline in the disability community of nothing about us without us. And I do believe from a government standpoint that that is applicable for our policies, for our programs, and the ways in which we engage our community, because we cannot do that without our community. And I do believe that accessibility is equity in action. I don't think that you can have an equitable program if you're not also talking about accessibility and language access. Because if you're not having conversation about accommodations and language access, you are not creating an equitable program. And so that's something that my role is to challenge that within the mayor's office and the administration, and that I am that person. I'm here with my partner, Talise, and our DEI office, and I do have a little bit of a reputation that I will call you out and call you in. And the reason that I do that is because if we are not operating from an accessible standpoint, we are not operating from an equitable standpoint. And so that goes for ADA accommodations, closed captions, making sure that people that communicate differently are included in the conversation that we're having. Because if they're not, then we're not doing equitable work.
Thank you. So Tiffany, thank you, first of all, Wells Fargo, for being a great supporter, and thank you for being here. From the for-profit perspective, what's your definition of equity?
Sure, thank you. That's excellent. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Maybe, maybe not. All right, so I love that. Call me well and then call you in. I think that's fantastic. So thank you so much for having me. It's fantastic to see all of you. Virtual hugs for everyone, even though we're together in person. So for me, and both myself as an individual, I like to say Tiffany Tavarez Incorporated as well as Wells Fargo, right? So each of us are our own individual companies with our own missions and values in addition to the organizations that we represent. I would say that equity is the very nuanced intersectionality of intentional inclusion as well as curated support. Equity is the courage to remind your fellow friend, colleague, family member, or neighbor that not all lives matter at all times in all circumstances. That sometimes you're going to have to curate love, you're going to have to curate money, you're going to have to curate people, profit, portfolio, the community that may need it most at any given time, place, or moment. And that takes courage.
Thank you. So we got a couple more questions for these folks, and we began that already, like how do you show equity in your various programs? But we want to flesh that out. Just to tee it up, I want to say that I've worked with some of you doing some consulting work in your strategic planning or board governance work, and I like to make an analogy that just like cars have parts, the radio, the wheels, just like our bodies have parts, ear, nose, and throat, and just like houses have parts, floor, walls, and roof, so do all these organizations have key parts. So the key parts could be, the key part of a house is the floor, the key part of a nonprofit is the programs. In the case of a foundation, the key part of a foundation is its grant making, maybe. For the for-profit, they don't have programs, but they have products and services. So Wells Fargo's product is banking services. So that's key. On the wall, a house has another wall, and in the nonprofit analogy that I'm making, another important part of our organization is the people who work there. That's all of you. Another important part of a nonprofit is the board of directors. Some of you have dual roles. By day, you're a paid staff member. By night, you're on the board of another organization. So the analogy that I'm making here on the screen is a house has floor, walls, and roof, and a organization has programs, product, or services, human resources, people who work there. On the right is the board of directors. And the fourth thing is operations. And under operations, I tuck in bringing in the money, allocating the money. That was me to shut up. And telling the story. What's going on back here? Suleiman, you need to give us a discount for the interruption. All right. So let's start with you, Chekemma. You have a program. That was me. I need to give you money, Christine.
Aha.
Suleiman, cancel. I don't have money. I'm volunteering here. Chekemma. So in the grant making that you do, your program, which is maybe grant making, convening, like how do you show equity? But let me add two more words. For the last 2 years, these other words have been bundled: diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. So in the work that you do as a grant maker, how do you exhibit, manifest, show DEI?
That's a great question. And I think some days I would give us a gold star on diversity. My new favorite word has become array. There is an array of funding priorities that we have. Anything from community for all. How do we ensure that parks are more accessible? So a project that I'm super excited about is a park that they're thinking about how children with diverse learning play together. How do they engage? And that's been a really exciting project, thinking about the slide and hearing students, I learned, have challenges when they go down the slide. And so they are building like a rubber walking slide. And that's just a great example of both diversity and inclusion. They're being intentional about the strategies. We look for opportunities to balance the options for young people. That is something that's very important to us. So when we are looking at our after-school programs, we are looking at things like which neighborhoods are they in and what are the demographics of that neighborhood and the needs, and how is this nonprofit organization adding to that ecosystem. So it's an array, and I think it really is a domain in which we look at organizational stability, we look at the viability of the project, but we always start with who are you serving, what are you bringing, and what does that community need that we know about. And if we don't know, we're not afraid to ask and sit down and have a lot of conversation, and I think that's critical to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, is being willing to listen more than you're speaking.
Great array, great use of the word array. So Allison, in the nonprofits that you've worked in, and now the ones that you support, how do you see the nonprofits, you kept within the time limit, so I didn't shut you up. How do you see those organizations implement diversity, equity, inclusion?
Yeah, so in both my nonprofit work, so I started out in the nonprofit sector decades ago with more of an organizing lens to the work. And so that's what I've brought into my work as an organizer, and then fast forward as a development director or a lead development staff person for community organizations, trying to get everyone involved in resourcing the organization's work and trying to get everyone to see that it is a team sport. Otherwise, it's not something that's sustainable. It's not something that everybody can also grow into and learn. Fast forward to now, being on the other side of the table, so to speak, I often get to work with organizations that are striving to be equitable. We come to every process, whether it's a change process, a DEI-specific process, or strategy building or organizational development. We do that with a lens of equity and also power, right? It's not only that folks get to be at the table, but what's the amount of power that they have to influencing or helping to make decisions about things. In a separate project that's related called Securing the Roots that I work with, it's really about what are kind of the ways that all of us as humans can come to these conversations, connecting to our own individual humanity, our own stories, and then having that also connect with the stories of everyone else at the table. It's kind of like, you know, looking out at everybody, which I have to say, it's wild to see all of these people in person, particularly folks who we've only seen each other over Zoom for I don't know how long, and I'm like, I almost want to touch your like arm and see that you're real. But all kidding aside, we see equity at Dragonfly and Securing the Roots really as literally meeting folks where they are. What are the tools that you need to come to the table? What are the tools that movement folks need to come to the table? It's much easier. We, in Securing the Roots, will have sessions where we invite folks from philanthropy, private foundations, or larger institutions, and they have conversations with these fellows who we've had, you know, lots of really candid conversations about what are you going to ask those funders. Some of you know about that in this room. And it goes back into this really funny dynamic where folks are like, well, hello, Miss So-and-so, I'd like to ask you a question. And to be able to peel back those layers for folks to access who they really are as humans, both the folks in philanthropy or government or private foundation, the private sector, where they're saying, this is the information I want to know as somebody who is curious about an organization. And likewise, this is the information I want to know as somebody from an organization who wants to access those resources for my folks. So that's how equity plays out in the relationships that we've had.
Super. So Amy, when you defined equity, you used the word access a lot. So tell us how at the mayor's office you try to implement issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and what are you doing with other mayoral entities to make sure that they have access and that they implement diversity, equity, inclusion?
Absolutely. So my office is housed in the Office of DEI for the City of Philadelphia. And so we work together as a team to focus on racial equity. The Office of LGBTQ Affairs and my office are critical, kind of that tripod that supports the office. We work with the other departments. Anyone know how many departments the city has? No? A lot. We got a lot. Just a few. And so what we do is we ensure that our partners in those departments have what they need to approach their specific work through a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But for me, it's really about fostering that belonging, because so much of our DEI work, we don't talk about disability. We don't talk about access. We don't talk about belonging. I think we're starting to get to a place that people are getting that there needs to be a B added to DEI strategies, right? Because if you don't belong, you're still requiring on a system of oppression, because that's what inclusion is. It means the dominant group is including you. They're bestowing you the act of inclusion. It's still an action verb, where belonging means I'm already here. I don't have to be invited to the table. I am the table. I'm right here. I'm at the table. And so I think that that's something that we're trying to really push. So many times people with disabilities, especially those that are service providers, talk about it as the goals of community participation. Could you imagine waking up and someone said, well, we're going to work on your community participation goal today, right? When you go to Target, you don't say, come on, kids, get in the van. We're going to the community. You're already in the community. You're an assumed member of the community. And so for me, in my role for the Office of People with Disabilities, is to ensure that people understand that people with disabilities are also within this community, and they have a right to be here. Philadelphia has the highest prevalence rate of disability of any U.S. city in our nation. It's 16.7%. And I think we're all here because we're also one of the poorest U.S. cities, correct? Right?
So we can't talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion without talking about the impact of poverty and disability and how that intersects. You can't center on race and not talk about that Black and African Americans experience disability at 14% when most races experience at 11. And so we can't talk about poverty and not talk about that people with disabilities experience poverty at higher numbers. And that even people with disabilities generally say that 31% report that they are in poor health. If you are Black with a disability, it's 63%. Our incarceration rate, 40% are people with disabilities. 25% of them receive special education services in their K through 12. 25% of our US prison population receive special education services. And so we can't talk about addressing the school to prison pipeline and not talk about the intersection of race and disability. We can't talk about poverty and not talk about disability. And so that's kind of how we take that approach, is that ensuring that disability and accessibility is a part of the conversation.
Thank you. Your comments remind me, before I go to Tiffany, so I read an article a couple of years ago, before COVID, of course. It was an Ethiopian refugee in Seattle, Washington, and she broke apart these three words. She says, here in Seattle, Washington, Seattle is very diverse, but I don't feel that I'm treated equitably, and I certainly don't feel yet that I belong. So many people lump these three words together, but they actually mean different things: diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Tiffany.
This has been really interesting. So here's what I'll say. So at Wells Fargo, the way that we're structured, I want to be sure that we're very specific. And actually, I'm thankful to Amy for even mentioning this, which is a lot of our work is centered around data, right? A lot of people are not really ready. They don't have the resources or the capacity to understand where they currently are. That is key to all of this work. Where are you currently? What are people feeling, both quantitatively and quantitatively? So right now, the way that it's structured, of course, we are the land of acronyms. So DSRI stands for Diverse Segments, Representation, and Inclusion. At Wells Fargo, we actually have a little under 2 dozen diversity, equity, inclusion councils that align to each of our lines of business. We do not all report to a head of DSRI for Wells Fargo. We are actually embedded in each of those lines of business because it is tied to actual improvement of how we operate as a company. So I report into the head of Wells Fargo Technology with a dotted line to the head of DSRI. I manage the Technology, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council. Our alignment to the company means that all of our outcomes are really the same. Those are 3 things: representation, mobility, and culture of inclusion. That's what we measure. So representation: who is coming into Wells Fargo to work? What do they look like? Mobility: the people that are currently there, are we able to retain them? Do they have opportunities for development? Are we championing our talent and our future workforce? And then culture of inclusion: do they actually feel like they belong? Do they feel like they can actually show up as themselves and still feel comfortable that the direct deposit is going to go through, that they're not going to get harassed by the manager? So those are kind of the 3 main components. I would say the 4th tenet that's kind of running parallel to all of this, which is how we show up in the community. What are our external engagement? Are we showing up at Asset Tech to recruit the best technologists who also happen to be Black and African American? So those are the types of things right now, I would say, how we're structured. So to give you a very quick overview. And data is a huge, huge component to that right now. Obviously, we have entire teams that are constantly evaluating the numbers, but we know numbers are only part of the story, but that's a really good place to start.
So that's great. You're setting it up for the next question. Your use of the word representation. And I like that you embed, so the DEI stuff is not within the Department of DEI, but it's embedded in all the business lines of Wells Fargo. So the house that you see, I wonder if it's still there, is house has floor, walls, and roof. So we've just talked about the floor. How do you embed, or how do you manifest DEI in your programming or your products and services? So back to Tiffany. How do you show, do you have quotas? What do you do to make sure that there's diverse representation at Wells Fargo, which is the left side of the house that's on the wall?
How much time do you have?
You have 3 minutes.
So there are a couple of things. I think that with Wells Fargo, we both look at kind of industry trends. So right now, when it comes to technology, across the country, there's horrible representation. I'm not going to even lie. There's horrible representation of women, of Latin, Latinx, Asian, people with disabilities, et cetera. We understand that. At Wells Fargo, we just essentially at the enterprise level, so that's across Thank you. Oh, there we go. Oh my God, I sound so much better. I know. I said great things. They'll confirm. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So, for instance, at Wells Fargo Technology, there I think 8% of our 220,000 plus employees identifies a person with a disability. Within technology, it's like 8.5%, and that technology subset is a little over 40,000 employees. So again, we're constantly trying to not just meet the number, right? Because that doesn't mean the work is done when you hit the number. It just means where is the lowest point that you're happy with starting with, at least? And oftentimes we don't meet that necessarily. The one thing I do want to point out that I did not talk about earlier, I remember when I learned that when seatbelts came out, right? It was something like 67% of women would either get injured or die in a car accident, simply because seatbelts were designed by white men, right? Safety was centered around the body of a white male. And so all of a sudden, the industry started to recognize, like, oh my goodness, if we have diverse teams, the technology that we produce can actually be for everyone, right? It can actually be protective in that way. And so for us, we really have to remind our Wells Fargo technology employees that when it comes to innovation, it's not that you need an extra cup of coffee or really brand spanking new conference room. You need to make sure that the teams actually reflect the people that you're trying to serve. And if you say you're trying to serve the community, that means actually everybody. And I wanted to really, preface the rest of the conversation with that.
Thank you. So Amy, in the government sector, where unions help or maybe hinder, where do you, what do you do regarding diversity in the left-hand wall of the House, which is the people who work in city government? What do you do?
So when I started in this role, that was actually one of my key strategies. It's still on my whiteboard at my desk, which is in my living room, like most of you, right? A lot of you. Right, so that whiteboard still has that I wanted to increase the representation of people with disabilities and to ensure that all of you, city departments, the mayor, city council were aware of the disability representation. I'm aware because it's my life, it's my children's life, and it's been the span of my work for 20 years. But it seems like nobody else seems to understand that. So what we did was we created a map using the latest census data to show where people with disabilities live in the city. And this map is actually the first of its kind in the nation. We're the first city to do this. It's a project that was led solely by people with disabilities within the city. And we created an interactive map. It's on our website. And you can click on any neighborhood and you can see how many people live in that neighborhood, how many are people with disabilities, by age, by race, and by ethnicity. And there is no other city that is having that conversation about what that intersectional lens of our neighborhoods looks like. And so I've made sure that it's free, it's available, it's being used for grant funding. I'm just saying, it's really good, useful to know the demographics of who you're asking for money for. And if you remember, I said 16.7% of people in Philadelphia are people with disabilities. We have neighborhoods where 42% of that neighborhood are people with disabilities. That same neighborhood is 89% identifying as Latino. It's also in one of our poorest neighborhoods. And I think you're all probably picturing like where that might be. But they're not the only one. Actually, 40% of our neighborhoods are over 20% people with disabilities. But are you ensuring that there's ASL and captioning and Braille available in your outreach? There's one neighborhood that 60% are age force people with disabilities, but there's no 0 to 5 children with disabilities in that neighborhood. Is that the neighborhood you do a pop-up for early intervention? No. Is it the one that you do job fairs and make sure people have what they need to apply for jobs? Absolutely, because only 19% of people with disabilities were employed last year. Only 19%. So that's a neighborhood you want to be doing outreach for employment, not early intervention. And so we're using that map to really inform our leadership, human resources, and I intentionally made the landing page is our city council district so that city council is aware of their representation of the residents and their constituents that they serve. So, and again, if you have a mostly mobility population in that neighborhood, but a very low deaf population, but the next neighborhood has a high deaf,
where would you provide the ASL as part of your universal design? So it's really helping you do accessibility, but intentionally and purposefully, and not just giving people what you think that they need, but actually understanding it.
Super. Thank you. Thanks for your advocacy. Allison, in the organizations that you've worked in and the ones that you support, how do you see diversity, equity, and inclusion play out? And I've heard that in the nonprofit sector, equity is synonymous with salaries. Like, how equitable is my salary? On the other hand, I've heard people cynically say, well, you made your bed and so lie in it. You chose to work at a nonprofit and not at Wells Fargo or not in Comcast. So just talk a little bit about equity in the nonprofit sector. Sure. As to staff, which is this wall of the house that we're talking to.
Yeah, and I want to say I like this house. I think I've seen it before.
I came up, it's copyrighted. Take it away.
I saw it from you. So with the range of organizations that I work with, you know, there are organizations, we have a lot of folks who are in the age of wanting to lean into democracy and maybe a form of equity. There's been a lot of horizontalizing of things and positions and staff included. And then when you mention salary, a lot of folks are looking at that and saying, well, that means that you're doing executive director kind of work and someone else is doing kind of, you know, and all of the things that fall to the shoulders of leaders and executive directors, and then someone else is doing something that does not carry a lot of the responsibility or weight, and they're all getting paid on the same level. That is something that we're now, with a lot of clients, a lot of folks we work with, trying to untangle that, trying to see, well, is that equitable? Is that democracy in action? What does it mean then when other folks have different needs? What does it mean when folks are coming from families where there's generational lack or where folks didn't have access to any kind of building up of equity, building up of the other definition of equity. And so we're talking with a lot more staff organizations and clients who are going through a process that Dragonfly Partners is going through, where we are looking at something called pay equity or compensation equity. We're talking about, let's put it all on the table. Let's put everything on the table. Some of us have dependents who are our children, who are our partners, who are parents, or, you know, some of us are in the sandwich kind of situation where we're caring for both. And laying all of that, as well as generationally, are we inheriting wealth? Are we accessing wealth in a different way? And then we're having these really authentic conversations about that to see what makes sense for how equitably we want to be compensated. We're doing that. We really believe that, you know, our own liberation is going to happen from each of us. So at Dragonfly, we're doing that, and we try to bring that with our clients. At Securing the Roots, we're trying to do the same thing, and we're encouraging or kind of leading by example. You know, like, what are the actions that we're doing as much as the words that we're kind of putting out there for folks. There are a lot of organizations that are trying this and practicing this. When it comes to salaries, I'll say all of these numbers about Philadelphia being the deepest level of poverty, what our disability looks like, what it looks like when it comes to access to healthy food in neighborhoods. Each year when I hear those numbers come out, honestly, I go, no shit. You know, we are this city, this huge urban area that has had generational poverty, and there aren't any quick fixes to get out of that. In the sector, you know, we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, now we're adding belonging, which is great, but also let's give a little more abundance to each of those words. They're not just that one, you know, subsection, and the time that we can give to each of those is really going to start to make larger impact, systemic impact. But salaries, they need to go up.
So I'm at Penn, I'm in two departments. One is the law school and one is the graduate school of social work, which has been renamed the Graduate School of Social Policy and Practice. A 27-year-old graduating from the law school takes a job in New York City, today makes $217,000. A social MSW student coming out of the Graduate School of Social Policy and Practice, same 27-year-old gets a job in New York City as a social worker with a master's, $60,000, $70,000. So great disparities, great inequity in salaries as to the for-profit and nonprofit sector. Chekemma, foundations have been challenged or accused of having super high salaries, and therefore people never leave, golden handcuffs. Talk about equity in the foundation philanthropic sector. Let's just put it out there.
I think that it's an interesting set of criticisms, right? I think in some cases, as we just talked about, you look at the nonprofit sector and you have the service being devalued, right? And then you look at what giving and its strategy, its thinking, its deep research, and those skill sets and activities tend to have a higher price point, right? And so I think that is a result of long-standing inequity and value in what's being delivered. That is a real thing. I think you see a lot of push towards exploring what is valuable and who gets to define that, and that's the critical piece of this equity conversation, is actually who is in the defining seat? Where is their power differentials and who gets to use their power? And so I think that it's a criticism worth exploring, right? To be quite honest, it's a criticism worth exploring, but I think it's not necessarily an indictment on philanthropy as much as it is being intentional about how we value the services that are driven. And I think philanthropy has a role to play in that, to be able to both validate, the salary inequities, have questions about that. There are many times, one of the things I have loved about my work is in our financial reviews, it will say, we think this ED is paid too low. And then I get to have conversations about what would it take to change that. And I mean, I was like, oh, this is so nice, you'll do this. I was surprised. I just got there in July, and as a former president of a nonprofit organization, I never had a funder have that conversation with me or anybody on my team. But I think that it is important to at least look at the full financial picture and ask the question, what would it take? And be clear when you ask the question if you're willing to do something to help that.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing?
Of course.
Can y'all hear me? No.
Check. All right.
All right, man, Amy got the magical mic right here, I know. All right, the one thing I want to add is that when it comes to the language that we use, right, that really cultivates whether or not we actually place value on the things that we say we care about. So the constant, pitting of nonprofit versus for-profit, that's also kind of cultivating the assumption that there aren't disparities and inequities in the nonprofit world by itself or the for-profit world. Because I can tell you, when you hand in your, deposit slip to the teller at the bank and you ask her, hey, in comparison to Tiffany, in comparison to Charlie Scharf, our president, do you feel like things are equitable? She or he are going to tell you hell to the no, right? So I just want to remind everyone that disparity exists whether or not you're pitting yourself against another sector or another company. I mean, you could just look at within your own organizations, I am sure as well. I've had the privilege of being able to work for a university, a foundation, and number of different companies, and there have been massive inequities in between all of those institutions and not just necessarily within those sectors. And I just want to, obviously remind people of that.
I mean, and there's nonprofits and nonprofits. Several years ago, we knew that the head of WHYY, a nonprofit, was earning $1 million. And then there's nonprofits here doing youth development, and you're certainly not earning $1 million. So let's wrap up by talking about the other part of this house. So a house has floor, walls, and roof, and a nonprofit has, or organizations have their programs, products, or services, the people who work there, and some of our organizations have board of directors. So let me begin with you, and then we'll end with you, and then if time permits, Q&A, and we're still going to have some breakouts so we can continue this conversation. So how does, at the board level of your foundation, or if you want to be representative of the funders here in the room, how does diversity, equity, how does it play out at the board level?
Well, I certainly don't think I can represent other people's foundations. I do think it's important to note all foundations are not equal. And so I work for a family foundation. It's a family philanthropy, so there's not a lot of diversity. Everybody is related, and they are similar in that way. There is diversity, though, in interest. There's diversity in what they care about, and so the challenge becomes how to have conversations that compare or really kind of showcase our investment strategy against those interests. But I'm in a very unique situation because it is family philanthropy, and everybody on the board is a part of a family.
So, but Chekemma, have you started the discussion? Oh, now you want it on my lap. Okay. How about bringing in outside voices? Anybody in this room, one of your grantees? Is that discussion started?
So we do have to be intentional about how we gain greater insight, but there are also regulations because I'm also in a trust and that came with some conditions that can't be removed. So there is room for non-family members, but that was picked before I got there, right? And so there are those realities are real for us, but being intentional about how we value both grantee voice and youth voice, because we are a K-12 foundation, we want to hear from young people directly about the benefits and the needs, and we also want to hear directly from staff and organizational leadership about the goals and directions that they have, and we are intentional about trying to gain a comprehensive picture outside of our own thoughts and reflections.
Happy to look at your trust, no charge, or maybe I will charge you, to see if indeed there's language that only family members can be members.
I can confirm for you that it is.
Okay, let's go on to Allison. Talk to us about what you've seen in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging at board levels of nonprofits that you've been working with.
Yeah, there's been a lot more representation from the community. A lot more folks are leaning into that, which is great. And then there's organizations who have always done that, and they continue to do that. There's also a lot of philanthropic, I guess, institutions or organizations that we work with who are in that position that you're kind of referring to, where they're actually having a diversity of opinion, particularly amongst generations. So it makes me smile whenever I hear people say, we're interested in having someone come and facilitate a conversation or a retreat for our foundation to really help hold space for these conversations, these hard conversations where you have maybe an older generation who wants to hold on to the resources. Maybe there are, a slew of reasons that range from because we always have to because we are here for the mission, and if we're not here, who else will fill that void? And then you have newer generations who are saying, it wasn't our money to begin with, and we need to be doing with these resources what it is that the folks in the community so desperately need. And that's where there's interesting things that are happening. I mean, I always invoke the name of the Dowdy Foundation locally here in Philly because I think what they did was brave, it was tremendous, and they made a huge impact. And they're not here, but their story is. Their story is. And I think that that's something that we're hopeful that more and more on boards, folks are getting courageous. They're inviting in new voices. They're inviting in new ideas. They're inviting in, new ways of being challenged, even for the existing members of their boards there. So that's how we're seeing diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging show up. And again, back to, I think everybody said it so far, just really emphasizing that, not tokenizing folks. I think some of us, we have moved away from that, where just the representation of people who are different from our boards previously or historically is not enough. It's having access to the decision making. It's having equal access to the decision making. It's having the say in how our funds or how our programming or what have you happens, how our strategy actually is created and carried out.
So governments don't have boards, advisory boards. So talk to us about your advocacy regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging to advisory boards that several governments have.
do the magical pass the mic game. So in the city of Philadelphia, we have several commissions which operate like advisory boards. I oversee the Mayor's Commission on People with Disabilities. It's currently a 17-member board, all of whom are people with disabilities. And our staff are 100% people with disabilities. And so for us, I think it's also important that so many times people will also come to us and say, we're trying to diversify our board. Can you give me a person with disabilities? And I'm like, no, that's gross. So gross. And if I had $1 for every time, I could start a foundation. And I serve on several boards at the state level that are governing boards, and I've really been challenging them to look at our diversity, because so many times for those of us focused on disability, there's so much diversity within the disability community. And so I shared with you that I am a person that lives with deafness, but I'm not culturally deaf. I was not born deaf, and ASL is not my first language. And so if someone is looking for deaf cultural representation, I would be an inappropriate person to serve in that capacity, right? Because I don't belong to that group. And same with that, just because a person has a disability doesn't mean they speak for the entire group. And I think that's important when we're talking about neurological differences, physical differences, language and communication differences, is why do you want to branch out and have people on your board that have those experiences? Is it because of the work that they've done? Or is it just because they check a different box than you already have? Because if it's just because they check another box, then you have another problem than filling an open seat. And so when we talk about diversity, we have to include that representation of disabilities. And I think language matters there. I've had people say that they're seeking differently abled or handicapable or special needs adults. That's not a thing, guys, okay? And there's, adult children with disabilities. No, they are an adult with a disability. There is no such thing as an adult child, okay? Just want y'all to understand that. So language matters when we're talking about that. You want family representation, or is it just because they happen to have a brother or a daughter or a sister? Or is it because that they're navigating the in-home nursing crisis? So we have to talk about those differences. We actually use the map when we did our outreach, and we've encouraged other departments that have, your lap is making a lot of noise. I know. Calm down over there. Y'all cursed. I'm not allowed to curse. So, back to the point that I was trying to make is that we want to make sure that when people are doing it, that they're doing it intentionally. When they're diversifying it. So just because, for example, the Office of LGBTQ Affairs took this to heart last year when they were doing their recruitment, is that they weren't just looking for queer and LGBTQ representation, they were looking for diverse experiences within that. And so to see people with disabilities with that lived experience now be on that board for the first time, it changes the outcome potential for your board, is because you're bringing in different voices and different possibilities.
And I would like to manifest that all of us in this room eventually be placed on a corporate board, please. That would be fantastic. It's funny, I actually got to spend some time with Maria Morris. She's an executive on one of the only women on the Wells Fargo Board of Directors at an event in New York last week. There's an organization called Women Business Collaborative who recently released a really interesting report about specifically women on boards. And the fact of the matter is, yes, women being represented on corporate boards has definitely increased, but as we know, that is still, hetero, neurotypical, cisgender white women that are on the boards. And oftentimes when that happens, they're like, whew, our work is done, and they keep it moving. And obviously we know that that is not an accurate statement. I do serve on a number of nonprofit boards, including the Pennsylvania Commission for Women under Governor Wolf, and it continues to be a challenge. Very much to your point, it's very transactional. It's almost like there's a menu, there's like a diversity menu, and they're like, I'll have Two of those. Yep, and I would love one of these. I mean, it's so performative and it's so painful. And more importantly, I get recruited to a board because people want to leverage my network. But I say, if you truly care about this work, then you would develop the relationship so you don't have to rely on the people with disabilities to connect with other people with disabilities. And not to mention, you're also assuming that our own networks and the people that we care about, the people that we advocate for, we only do that for the people that look like us or have the same lived experience as us, and that's not true. I tell people all the time, if you need a piano teacher, if you need a personal chef, if you need someone to do your accounting, if you need a mortgage, or if you want dance lessons, in my network, I have people to cover all of that, right? Like, don't limit me to what you perceive my affinity to be, especially if you've never asked me the question. So I think that's number one. You have to start to get comfortable asking people, how do they identify? What are their affinities? And who is it that they're willing to connect you with and advocate for, et cetera? And then sometimes you never know. Their interest may be in actually extending their network and only connecting with people that they don't have or the people that they don't know. And I think that's an opportunity for us to kind of, I would like to say, curate the people portfolio, right? What do you want your people portfolio to look like? What perspectives are you missing? And what perspectives oftentimes that you avoid simply because you're uncomfortable asking those questions? And the last point I'll make when it comes to board representation is that we need to stop interchanging the word diverse for the affinity or the lived experience that we're specifically talking about. Diverse and diversity is a really beautiful word, but if you meant to say black, then say black. If you meant to say Asian, then say Asian. If you meant to say veteran, then say veteran. But every time we misuse that word, we are diluting the people, we are diluting the purpose, and we're never going to get anywhere. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to channel last night's debate between Oz and Fetterman. I'm going to give you each the last parting words of wisdom, but I'm not going to give you a minute. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. In 30 seconds or less, parting words of wisdom.
The journey to equity is a lifestyle, not an event, so don't make this conversation your first or your last stop.
Dang.
Give this woman a grant. Allison.
Okay. How can we make an equitable Philadelphia? So it's got to be continuing these minimum of 3-year grant funding cycles that folks are doing. Good job. Good job. At least 3 years. 5, 10 would be amazing. General operating, or somebody said like JOPS or something. I was like, nobody calls it that. But continue with the general operating. Have folks self-determine what they're going to do. And please release more funds for us because we need them. We need them. We've reorganized our houses, our organizations, and we can't keep up with it. We can't get all the things that we need for our houses anymore. So, more funds.
That's really great. A lot of people know that this is kind of like my tagline, is that I really believe that lived experience produces a fidelity that systems can never duplicate. You can't teach it, you can't learn it, and you certainly can't pay for it. It's not going to be the same. It doesn't taste the same. It's like forgetting the sugar in a cake. It might look like a cake, but it certainly don't taste like a cake. And so I think that we have to be invested. To your point about the debate, I just want to call out how much of the people have attacked Fetterman for using captioning, for using assistive technology. You're here to listen to what I have to say, and I'm using captioning and assistive technology to have the equitable opportunity to be a part of this panel. And so I challenge you that if you're critical of people that are using assistive technology to create equitable space, then you need to remove yourself from that conversation because you're the one. That's the problem. There is absolutely a space for accessibility in leadership, and disability and intellect do coexist, and capacity and disability intersect.
I really should have gone first. This was really beautiful. There are a couple things that come to mind. One, leadership is not leadership unless it is inclusive and resilient to silence, right? We all witness inequity. We all see inequity. We know people who you're like, yeah, they're super cool, let's go give them a hug, but then let's stand across the room. Like, we know who are the kind of full-time oppressors and aggregators of just those macro and microaggressions. We know who they are and what organizations they are a part of. We need to start calling out some people. We need to start calling out some people because every time that we walk away and don't have the audacity to match our level of ambition, we are complicit in that behavior. Whether or not you think it's direct or indirect or active or not, we are complicit in that behavior. And more importantly, we are responsible for the cultures that we cultivate, whether or not it's actually the culture you need to thrive and belong. So to me, your commitment and resilience to that silence is going to determine whether or not you are a DE&I lobbyist and not just a hobbyist.
Thank you all. Thank you, Philanthropy Network. Turn it over to